A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, some insights today into that recent gathering of the speakers, those intellectuals, those leaders at the annual ARC conference in Sydney. ARC, A-R-C. It stands for Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. And Christian social commentator David Robertson is back with us. Hey, David, welcome back to 2020.
Yeah, it's nice to be back with you.
Hey, Dave, you went to the ARC conference, is that right?
Yeah, I did. I was there the whole day.
All right, well, I didn't get to go. So let me tell you what I heard. I heard it was a great talk fest, but very little acknowledgement of God and Jesus Christ as the foundation of the sorts of freedoms we'll often talk about that formed our Western nations. How do you see things? Was there a prominence of God at the ARC, or was there a minimisation of him?
Well, there's a lot of Christians there, but I think your viewers need to remember ARC is not a Christian organisation. It's not an evangelical organisation. It's not a political organization. It's not a religious organization. So, turning up and saying, well, I wish there'd been more of Jesus Christ, you can understand that. But to me, that's the equivalent of reading the book of Esther and saying, well, it shouldn't be in the Bible because it doesn't mention the word God. And I think I think there's an element of truth in it that unlike the London ARC conference, there were no clergy speaking. There were a lot of Christians there, I recognized. And I think many of the people who did speak were Christians. But I don't know. I think if your foundation, let's say your foundation is like your skeleton, you don't always have to see the skeleton. In fact, there's something wrong if you're seeing the skeleton. If you're talking about economics and family life, which they were, and what's going on in the world and what it means to be a citizen, I'm not sure that you need to justify that by having someone say Jesus is Lord.
Okay, interesting perspective, and perhaps, yes, if you were contemplating the thoughts of freedoms that come on this conservative side of the political spectrum, that those might have those foundations more prominent, then you might have been disappointed. But I appreciate your insight there. Hey, there were, a bunch of keynote speakers, Jordan Peterson among them, Neil Ferguson, the historian, and, of course, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, also very prominent. And one of the founders, the former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson, he was there too. What did you make of the way that he was presenting perhaps an introduction to ARC and its arrival in Australia?
Well, I think John Anderson is the key person for ARC in Australia. And there's a very interesting thing that happened with John Anderson because not so long ago, he attempted to get back into politics through the Nationals. Now, given that he was by far their best politician, it seemed like a no-brainer. But I think he was excluded because of, well, maybe he's so popular, but because of his overt Christianity. And I know that many people were disappointed at that. I actually think that's turned out to be a great thing because it's released John to do what he does best, which he has a superb podcast, and now he's leading ARC. He's a very committed Christian who's in leadership of it and encourage people to pray for him. I thought his introduction and summing up were two of the highlights of the day, actually, and very thankful for John. I don't want you to get me wrong. I think there were things that I was a little bit more disappointed in, but he certainly wasn't one of them.
When he made his summing up speech, I think I've got the context right here, he made a call for an end to what he called declinism. That's a terminology perhaps new to a lot of our listeners, declinism. Did you have any insight around that word and what he intended by it?
Yeah, I think declinism is kind of, it's the guy standing outside on the street with the woe is me, the end of the world is nigh type stuff, and sometimes you can do that. I mean, I was reading I when I look at the American election, which we've discussed before on your show, I get a sense of despair. I'm far too interested in it, and I need. Martin Luther said to Philip Melanchthon at one point, "Philip, you need to stop trying to run the world. You're not in charge of the world. God is. God is sovereign." And I think what John was saying it was that we have this narrative of decline. We see so many things that are negative, in the same way as there are people who maybe have a narrative of, hey, everything's progressing, everything's going to be fine, where there's a much more realistic position. So I would argue that what he was saying is that decline is not inevitable, but the reason for ARC existing is to call people back, if you like, to what are the Christian foundations of Western civilization, the Judeo-Christian foundations of that. And I think that's exactly what he was doing. He was saying, look, we should have hope. And, I got a lot of hope. I mean, there were 700 delegates there, and there were many people from many different walks of life. And so I understand why there's a reason for more optimism. I personally would tend to be a little bit more on the negative side than John, I suspect, because I do think that we're in danger of coming greatly under the judgment of God because of our rejection of him. But I understood what he was saying and was quite inspired by it.
You've got to have, haven't you, a sense of realism and recognising that there is a threat that is there. But I imagine that you've got a John Anderson and in an inspirational moment calls for an end to declinism by saying that why is it that our attitude is that the best days are in the past rather than ahead. So I guess it's a leadership thing to be able to say to people, these are difficult times, there are threats and there are things taking us backwards, but let's be optimistic. And in a sense here, a call for a change of attitude that says the best days need to be ahead. I imagine that from a leadership position, that's something that probably is a strength, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we don't know that the best days are ahead. I mean, look, when Jesus wrote his letters to the 7 churches in what is now Turkey, within a few hundred years, none of them existed. It is possible that there can be a decline in a civilization. So we're not guaranteed that. But I think what he was trying to say is, so for example, in the question of indigenous relationships, and Jacinta Price was there, and I thought she was wonderful. I mean, of course, she had the good taste to marry a Scotsman, so I would think that. But, is there a lot of racism and disadvantages against indigenous people? Yeah, I think there is. In many circumstances, people face that. But is that all that there is? No. Are there many good things happening? Yes, there are. So I think sometimes if you're in media or if you're in an organization trying to get people to support you, it's much easier to sell copy or to get supporters through negative stories. And I think we need a balance. You used a very good word there. I think we need I would say we need a biblical realism about what is going on. And that for me is what Art was trying to say. I thought, I didn't think John was over the top, but I thought Tony Abbott was over the top. That, for example, saying that Australia was the least racist country in the world. I don't know how you would ever prove that. But things like the public nearly always knows what's best and nearly always chooses smaller government. Well, I'm not convinced the public does nearly always know what's best. But I kind of understood what he was trying to say. So it was a very stimulating conference in that I found myself disagreeing with a fair bit of it as well.
As we always discover each week, there's something that really takes us into a new attitude to some of the issues. I'll talk to you some more about Tony Abbott in just a few moments, but just stay with us for a moment on this biblical realism. The thought that, there are some that think that being a biblical Christian is all about positivity, and I think you've just taken that out of the equation here for a moment, because biblical realism can recognise that there are challenges, but also has this hope in Christ for his deliverance. Just a biblical realism thought or two from you for a moment here. Do you think we need to have an adjustment? I mean, for listeners, is this a time for an adjustment to a biblical realism and a moment when we can think about these things?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the late, great Tim Keller used to have this summary of the gospel, which was, you are far worse than you think you are, and you're much more loved than you think you are. And I would argue that, sometimes people don't realize, I mean, as you know, I do a podcast every week, and sometimes people say, oh my goodness, it's like heavy, some of the things, when you look at what's happening. There are things that are horrendous and horrific and probably far worse than we think they are. But I would just simply say biblical realism. You go back to the Bible and you realize there's nothing new under the sun. Plague, famine, war, corruption, all these things have been in society. And I think it is possible to be realistic and not to despair, because as Christians, we have hope in the Christ who's going to renew all things.
Let's come back to former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, and you say you disagreed with his thoughts about Australia and whether we have a racism streak here. He did come out against wokeness, and he labelled wokeness a travesty. And I guess that's something most Christian believers, when you recognise that woke typically is an anti-Christian position, that's something that we would all sort of agree is a travesty. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't disagree with everything that Tony Abbott said. In fact, I probably agreed with most of what he said. But I mean, I particularly agreed on the wokeness thing, because look, the first book I ever wrote was called Awakening, about revival through Robert Murray McShane in Scotland and in the church I used to be. And Christians of all people want to be awake. But the word woke now has come to stand for those who are for particular, inverted commas, they say progressive. I think they're actually regressive causes. And, a particular emphasis on changing the language and so on. And it's a disaster. In fact, another way of putting it is what I would call cultural Marxism. And I think one of the things that the ARC conference needs to work out is to realize, I think they do realize this, but they need to perhaps express it a bit more strongly, which is going back to where we came in, that the antidote to cultural Marxism is cultural Christianity. Now, I don't mean by cultural Christianity just people who want the benefits of Christianity, the fruits without any of the roots. What I mean is a Christianity which permeates through the whole nation. When we say that Australia is a nation founded on Christian principles, we're not saying that there's ever been a point where the majority of people in Australia were committed biblical Christians. What we're saying is that the ethos and the culture was permeated through by Christian values because of the commitment of people who did it. So, for example, Australia was opposed to slavery right from the beginning. How was that? Well, it's because of William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect, and the first chaplains that were sent were very convinced, anti-slavery people. So, Wilberforce, his whole ethos eventually went through the whole of society. And that's what I would argue, that is what we need. But no, Abbott was absolutely correct to warn about wokeism, or I think cultural Marxism will kill this country if it's allowed to take over. And
he did draw some level of biblical attention, naming or comparing the Ark to the biblical story of Noah's Ark and how the Ark was designed to save humanity. Can you give that level of importance to the Ark, that it is there to save humanity, or is it really the values that are being espoused?
Yeah, our Ark is not going to save humanity. Ark's not going to. I mean, we have to avoid all these kind of grandiose things. Although what Ark is pointing to, so the danger with Ark, of course, is there are lots of people. Neil Ferguson, Ian Hersey-Ali, who's actually married to Jordan Peterson, many people involved in it, and they certainly all want the fruits of Christianity. And I think most of them recognize it's virtually impossible to have that without the roots. But it is not a specifically Christian organization. It is, there was a Jewish lady spoke on the family who was absolutely superb, Erika Komisar. In fact, for me, probably the best speaker of the day. And, you know, so Ark, this organization, is not the Ark, which was built by Noah. I think if you're going to use that, I would say the Ark in contemporary terms is really the church communicating the gospel and bringing people on board and so on, rescuing them from the wrath that is to come. But yeah, no, it was an interesting comment from Tony.
I know there'll be some listeners who are maybe sitting on the edge of their seat thinking, what's he got to say about Jordan Peterson, the clinical psychologist, has a huge following around the world, says a lot of very sensible things, public intellectual he's called, and he addressed things like leadership and responsible citizenship and the family unit and free market trade and the bridge between religious and scientific views. Did you have an impression about the impact of his delivery at the Ark?
Yeah. Now, I'll preface this by saying I love Jordan Peterson. I've actually met Jordan Peterson the last time he was in Sydney. I read a lot of his stuff. I think he's been a real gift to humanity, and I love his compassion. I love a lot of his wisdom. But I thought his talk was particularly disappointing. Peterson follows Jung, the psychologist, and you know he stated things within his talk like the accumulation of Protestantism is that each person will become their own church. Well, that's just simply false. You know, that is not what Protestant teaches. It teaches that there is one church, the Church of Jesus Christ, and we don't all get to have our own church. But I think the worst thing that he said was that the absolute maximum meaning was to be found. Now get this, meaning is to be found in the adoption of maximal voluntary responsibility. And he talks about going up Jacob's ladder. You know, you have yourself and then your family and then maybe your community and then your nation and so on. And you get to the top of the ladder to whatever transcendent thing there is. And it was so unclear and so... And ultimately, I wrote an article for it, which is on the Christian Today website. And I said that what Peterson was doing was moralistic therapeutic deism, is what we would call it, with a twinge of, self-flagellation almost. And I just felt there was really no hope in it. You know, it was a very, very disappointing talk, and compared to what I've heard him say before, he seems to have gone backward. Now, he did say that he'd just done an hour-and-a-half interview with Richard Dawkins and Alex O'Connor, and I watched that subsequently, and I'm afraid that Richard Dawkins took Peterson to the cleaners. Okay. And again, he was very disappointing within that. So it seems to me that Jordan Peterson has got... kind of the moralistic side of Christianity, and he's got a lot of good stuff to say, you know, proverb style wisdom almost, but he just doesn't have Christ, and without Christ it's just all useless, because none of us can meet up to those standards. And to be honest, Peterson looks as though he's an incredibly burdened man, and I understand that, because he does seem to have a genuine compassion, but he can take on the sins of the world. He can't even take on his own sins, and for that, I think he needs Christ, and that's what came over to me. And I actually felt very moved for him in that. I like him enormously, as I said, but I just thought, oh my goodness, you don't have Christ.
We can
ultimately means you got nothing.
We can like people like that, and we pray for a level of discernment so that we can recognise those things that come from a humanistic standpoint, and separate those and contrast those, those things that are coming from a transcendent presence of God standpoint. Wonderful insights as always, David Robertson, and for listeners to connect with David and to find out about how you can listen into his weekly podcast, theweflea.com, theweflea.com. David is minister at the Scots Kirk Presbyterian Church in Newcastle in New South Wales. His insightful blog is called theweflea.com. His latest book is called Seek. David, thanks so much for another great insight today on 2020.
Well, it's a privilege as always being with you, and God bless the listeners as well.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.